Since Russia invaded Ukraine last year, President Zelensky has been pleading with the West to give his country tanks to beat back the Russian invaders. Although hesitant at first, now that Ukraine looks like it has a good chance of winning the conflict, the West has finally agreed to send over a mix of its most advanced tanks. But with only a few hundred tanks pledged so far, how will Western tanks change the course of the war in Ukraine? Between January and February 2023, the leaders from 13 different nations have offered or already sent main battle tanks to Ukraine. Among these are 88 German-made Leopard 1 tanks, approximately 100 newer Leopard 2 tanks, 31 American M1 Abrams, and 14 British Challenger 2 tanks. All told, these tanks equal about 233 tanks pledged as of the making of this video. While that might not seem like a lot, it might have a bigger impact than you think. Based on current Ukrainian doctrine, a tank battalion consists of 30 to 40 tanks. A tank brigade comprises 3 battalions, and these brigades are equipped with 90 to 120 tanks. So current pledges from Western countries allow Ukraine to form almost 3 whole tank brigades. This matters because experts believe that at least 4 tank brigades composed of Western tanks will be required to be decisive on the battlefield. However, these pledges are just the beginning, and more tanks will likely be donated in the future. Additionally, the Ukrainians have shown that they are adept at employing forces correctly. For example, during both the Kharkiv and Kherson offensives, Ukrainian forces were outnumbered and outgunned. Yet, through clever tactics, careful planning, and courage on the battlefield, they won the day both times. So even with the current number of tanks pledged, the Ukrainians will certainly make good use of them. Even though Ukraine is going to receive hundreds of modern tanks, how will it make that much of a difference on the battlefield? After all, the German army fielded some of World War II's most powerful tanks in its Tiger and King Tiger class of tanks, but they were not present in enough numbers to affect major change on the battlefield. However, a similar situation will not play out for Ukraine despite Russia's numerical superiority in people and equipment for several reasons. The first reason is the tanks that the West is sending to Ukraine are head and shoulders better than anything the Russians can throw into the fight in sufficient numbers. The Russians have fielded the T-64, T-72, T-80, and T-90. There are also rumors that the newest T-14 Armata tanks have been deployed inside Ukraine. However, most of the tanks in service are the older T-series tanks. For example, the T-64 is the primary main battle tank of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Militias. The Russian army primarily uses the T-72 and T-80. The newest version of the T-64, the T-90, has seen heavy use in Ukraine, but with current losses and maintenance problems, only a few hundred might be prowling the battlefield at any time. Russia's most advanced tank, the T-14 Armata, has fewer than 24 operational models, and just a handful have been rumored to be in Ukraine. With armor, weapons, gun sights, and communications comparable to Western tanks, it's the only vehicle in Russia's inventory that could match the capability of what NATO has. Though T-90s and T-14s are rarely seen in Ukraine, the Russian T-72s and T-80s are their main battle tanks. The T-72 was an improvement of the T-64 tank, a generational leap in Soviet armor technology. The T-80 was designed to improve on the flaws from their T-72 design, which included things like a switch to a gasoline engine, active protection systems, and a better fire control computer. Both of these tanks have been a mainstay in both the Russian and Ukrainian militaries since the fall of the USSR. The main issue facing Ukraine has been that the Russians greatly outnumber them in terms of armor. But as media reports have shown, not all of Russia's reserve tanks are serviceable. However, compared to Ukraine's numbers, Russia has a nearly inexhaustible supply of them, to the point that no matter how many Ukraine destroys, more Russian tanks appear to take their place. Fortunately for the Ukrainians, the odds are stacked heavily in their favor when comparing the likes of the T-72s and T-80s in direct combat with the best tanks that NATO countries can throw at them. While not getting too much into exact capabilities, limitations, and dimensions of each tank, the Abrams, Challenger, and Leopard all share some standard features. Except for the Leopard 1 tanks, the rest of the tanks the West is sending to Ukraine are quite heavy. Depending on the model, sent, fuel, and ammunition loadout, these tanks weigh in the 60-ton range, up to more than 70 tons for some models of Abrams tanks. By comparison, the T-72 and T-80 weigh about 45 tons combat loaded. The main reason why these tanks weigh so much more is mainly due to the armor surrounding them. Although the details are classified, we do know that the armor protecting these tanks is made of a mixture of composite armor and steel, creating a strong, flexible material ideal for tank armor. This material is then sandwiched between layers of steel plating to give the tank strength and flexibility. While Russian tanks also support composite armor, experts agree that combat experience has shown that the Western tanks have far superior armor than Russian tanks. However, being so much heavier than Russian tanks, Western tanks needed much more powerful engines. Germany, the US, and the UK have stepped up to the plate and put out some impressive engineering. For example, one of the main ways to measure tank maneuverability and speed is its power-to-weight ratio. The power-to-weight ratio is measured by how much horsepower a tank's engine can produce divided by its weight. The lower the ratio, the less effective and more underpowered the tank is in the field. The most common Russian tank, the T-72, has a power-to-weight ratio of about 19, depending on its armor package. However, even the heaviest model of the Abrams, weighing almost 30 tons more, has a power-to-weight ratio of 21. The Challenger 2 and Leopard 2 sport even higher ratios in the mid-20s. That means that even though the Western tanks are much more heavily armored, their better engineering allows them to be as maneuverable as the T-72 without sacrificing crew survivability. Even though the Russian T-80 tank has a much more powerful engine with a power-to-weight ratio on par with its Western counterparts, the T-80 is very fuel inefficient, due in part to its design and poor tactics. In fact, the Russian logistics arm was so inept at keeping its gasoline-fed tanks supplied after the First Chechen War that later models of the T-80 had to be made with diesel engines to lessen supply woes. While Russian tanks certainly lack the armor protection of Western tanks and are just slightly better in speed and maneuverability, Western tanks literally blow Russian tanks out of the water in terms of firepower. As far as the main armament, Western tanks are armed with a 120mm gun. Two notable exceptions for the tanks that are being sent are the Challenger 2 and Leopard 1. The Challenger 2 is armed with a rifled cannon compared to the smoothbore cannon the other tanks use. The main reason was the British doctrine called not just for a tank killer, but a mobile firing platform to support infantry assets. A rifled gun allows the tank to fire high-explosive squash-head ammunition. This ammo type uses tension to break off pieces of armor and fortified buildings to create a sort of shotgun effect inside that sends parts of the tank, building, or bunker flying around without actually having to penetrate it. The Leopard 1 is different in that it sports a 105mm main gun. This tank is a smaller gun because during most of the Cold War, when these were made, the 105mm round was a standard tank round used in Western militaries. T-72s and T-80s used the venerated 125mm smoothbore gun. Despite being slightly larger in caliber, the West has developed overall better breeches, gun sights, and fire control computers that allow their tanks to outgun anything the Russians can put on their battlefield in numbers. For example, despite being of a slightly smaller caliber than their Russian counterparts, the Western tanks donated to Ukraine have better breeches than the T-72 or T-80. Because they get a better seal and can take higher pressures, Western tanks can shoot ammunition at greater velocities, thereby increasing their range. The added velocity also more than makes up for the slightly smaller caliber, since it still has more energy when leaving the barrel. But having a higher velocity round would mean nothing if the gunners could not see the target. And that's where Western tanks truly win this battle. The gun sights inside Western tanks are better in every way compared to their Russian counterparts. The sights are much more user-friendly, with less complicated reticles, laser rangefinders, and thermal imaging. While some upgraded versions of the T-72 and T-80 tanks are equipped with advanced sights, battle losses, and sanctions significantly cut down on their availability. In fact, with Western sanctions, Russian tank manufacturers have tried to make replicas of the gun sights they got from countries like France, but these sights reportedly cut the effective range in half of what it was before. But what makes Russian gunnery even worse is their outdated fire control computers. In Western tanks, once a gunner gets the range to the target during an engagement, all the data like range, temperature, elevation, barrel heat, wind, and several other factors are fed to the computer. These computers send signals to adjust the barrel to keep it on target automatically. Russian tanks force their crews to input this information manually, which wastes precious seconds in a firefight. Western fire control technology is so powerful that every main battle tank can also shoot on the move. Most Russian tanks simply do not have this capability. For T-72s and T-80s to engage their targets, they must be sitting still to get the most accurate fire control solution possible. While Russia did make some improvements in the T-80, only the T-90 and T-14 Armata have any chance of consistently hitting targets on the move. Thankfully, Russia also has very few of these tanks on the battlefield. When these Western tanks finally reach Ukraine and are sent into battle, we might see a similar result to what happened during the Gulf War. Because the Gulf War was the first direct conflict between modern Western technology and legacy Soviet systems, it's the best comparison for how a modern showdown would look. And spoiler alert, it's not looking good for Russia. During the Gulf War, American Abrams and British Challenger 1 tanks, the predecessor to the Challenger 2, destroyed thousands of Iraqi tanks. Arguably, the most notable example of this lopsided victory is in the Battle of Medina Ridge. During this battle, 2 American armored brigades, a mechanized infantry brigade, and supporting air detachments fought against elements of several Iraqi divisions, including 3 armored divisions. The end result was a nightmare for the Iraqis. The Iraqis lost 186 tanks, mostly T-72s, and almost another 200 armored fighting vehicles. Only 3 American tanks were disabled, with 1 being more classified as a complete loss. With supporting air elements destroying 38 tanks, M1 Abrams tanks knocked out Iraqi tanks with a loss ratio of almost 40-1. The battles at places like Medina Ridge, 73 Eastings, and Norfolk have been intensely studied. Numerous factors are cited when justifying the success of Western tanks, and poor weather played a huge part in places like Medina Ridge. With it being rainy and overcast, American tanks could shoot Iraqi tanks before Iraqi gunners could even sight the Americans. Armor also gave the Western tanks a considerable edge. With better guns and ammunition, the American tanks could crack through even the frontal armor of T-72s with ease. On the other hand, Iraqi gunners did score numerous hits on American tanks and with few exceptions caused 0 damage. But despite these advantages, the most significant deciding factor that all experts agree on in securing a coalition victory was coordination with combined arms. American and British tanks advanced in with their infantry units. Air and artillery attacks were called in to knock out stubborn resistance before American ground units were ever sent in. Iraqi units weren't trained in combined arms combat and were anchored in fixed positions. For example, at Medina Ridge, had the fight been even in terms of technological capability, the Iraqi defensive positions would have been a difficult nut to crack. However, once outflanked, Iraqi commanders lacked the operational expertise to coordinate counterattacks with supporting infantry and artillery. In fact, several counterattacks were made by armored vehicles, but these were quickly wiped out since they were made without supporting elements. Russia faces a very similar situation in Ukraine. Ever since the Kharkiv and Kherson offensives, Russia has been focused on digging in and holding the ground it conquered early in the war. While Russia dreams of conducting a large offensive sometime in the future, numerous experts have not seen any increase in Russia's capability to conduct a combined arms offensive. Most experts predict that Russia will only be able to hold on to the territories it's already conquered while conducting limited, fruitless offensives in places like Bakhmut. It's here where massed infantry attacks slowly grind Ukrainian defenders down that Russia hopes to have some measure of success. However, these brutal tactics only work to achieve limited tactical and operational success. As a grand strategy to win this war, it's a poor one. On the other hand, Ukraine has shown it's more than capable of conducting combined arms offensives. With NATO countries leading the effort to train every branch of its military, the Ukrainian armed forces are more adept than ever before at working in close coordination with each other. With the delivery of several new tank brigades, Ukraine will likely be able to repeat the success of battles like Medina Ridge, where a numerically inferior force with good weapons, training, and coordination can utterly destroy an enemy who, though outnumbers them, is inflexible, untrained, and is equipped with inferior weapons. As long as Western governments continue providing the training, logistics, and maintenance support these kind of tanks need to function, they absolutely will be a game changer in this war. Now go check out why Putin is scared of the West sending tanks to Ukraine, or click this other video instead.